think it's time to blow this scene. Get everybody in the stuff together. Okay, 3, 2, 1, let's jam.
Documentos Clasificados. El día de hoy tenemos un invitado súper especial, espectacular. Y bueno, pues ya lo está viendo usted en sus pantallas, pero quiero ceder el micrófono a mi compañero y amigo Jaime Carreño, que está allá en Canadá y que lo va a presentar. Adelante, Jaime.
¿Qué tal, Daniel? Amigos, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo están? Efectivamente, hoy estamos muy contentos y tenemos el honor de tener a un gran escritor, editor, y que trabajó muchos años en Marvel. Sé que ahora está trabajando en algunas cosas en Marvel, ya platicaremos al respecto. Él es nacido en Argentina, también latinoamericano como nosotros, y él es el gran Fabián Nicieza. Fabián, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Muchas gracias.
Okay, so Fabián, let's start with the first question. Can you let us know, how did you start working in comics? How was your start in comics?
The origin story. My starting comics, well, which way? My starting comics as a reader or my starting comics working in them? I started reading them when we first came to the United States. I was 4 years old and my brother was 7. And we asked to buy comics because we recognized Batman and Superman on the newsstands. So that got me reading and writing English faster. And by the time I started school in first grade, and I was already reading and learning, knowing how to read and write the language. So we just kept reading comics because we liked them, and both my brother and I drew. So we did that as well. I realized I wanted to become a writer at some point in my hopeful future when I was around 10 or 12 years old. And I wrote a lot back then when I was younger. And while in college, I realized that I needed to have a steady paycheck before I could ever become a writer. So I gravitated towards public relations and advertising for my college major because I thought that would get me in a position where I'd be closer to the opportunities to write. Ultimately, that led in a coincidental way to becoming advertising manager at Marvel Comics. I got that job in 1985, and I was Marvel's advertising manager for 5 years, and then I was an editor for about 5 years. It was during that time, early on, that I started to sell my writing and my stories to the editors at Marvel. So my first published comic was 1987, and I just kept writing, and it got to a point where the writing was it was earning more income than the staff job was, but I was spending far more time on the staff job. So I left Marvel in 95, and then for the last 25 years, it's been a combination of office environment jobs and freelance writing in a career well outside of comics as well, because much of what I've done to earn a living has been outside of comics for the last 20 years.
Jaime, pues obviamente en esta época en la que él ingresa a lo que es Marvel Comics, pues es una etapa muy prolífica, sobre todo en tema de dibujos animados, ¿no? ¿Hubo algún tipo de influencia sobre él, sobre lo que existía antes en dibujos animados o lo que existía en ese momento? ¿Hubo alguna influencia para él?
So at that time, there was some boom of cartoons at that time in TV. Did you receive any influence on the cartoons while you were writing comics, Fabián?
When I was writing comics?
Yeah.
No, not at all. No. If I had an influence from cartoons, it was growing up watching them. So when I first came to this country, to the United States, the Spider-Man cartoon was on Saturday morning television. And then a few years after that, the Super Friends cartoon was on. And Bugs Bunny, I'm not a religious person, so Bugs Bunny was as close to a religion as I had growing up. So all of those things are absolute influences on me growing up. But if you're asking me if the cartoons that were airing, like the X-Men cartoon or the Spider-Man cartoons,
Yeah,
were an
did they influence you?
on my, no, they were taking from us, not the other way around.
Oh, okay.
I'm honestly, I find the question a little offensive because I was already a professional writer writing the #1 book for Marvel when the cartoons was starting, and they were taking stuff from us without giving us opportunities to write the cartoon. So it's a whole nother question that you're asking me. I don't hold the cartoons in very high regard at that time, not because I was watching them, I wasn't, but because I was never very comfortable with the way they ignored the comic book writers, even though they were more than happy to take absolutely anything they could from our storylines to incorporate it into their cartoons.
So they didn't recognize you at all?
Okay.
What?
They didn't recognize you at all in the cartoons? Or mention in the credits?
No. The running joke we had back then was that Scott Lobdell and I, because we were writing the books at that time, we were guaranteed that we were going to get to write the 66th episode of a 65 episode order. so they had their contract to produce 65 episodes, and they were guaranteeing us we'd get to write the 66th one. No, there was I've never really talked to the cartoon guys. I know of them by their names and their reputations, and many of them have reputations of being really good guys and straight shooters and good story editors. But they really treated us with incredible indifference back then. They were more than happy to take anything they could from the pre-existing comics or the ones we were creating at the time and adapt that into their cartoons. But they didn't really give us much in the way of credit, much less opportunity to work on them ourselves. Not that it paid. I mean, guys, you got to understand, writing a cartoon doesn't pay all that great. Writing an episode of the X-Men animated series probably at that time would have paid me less than writing an issue of the comic, because we were getting incentives based on sales, and our sales were tremendous. So animation scripts are not exactly a great way to try to earn a living if you want to be a writer.
Okay. Oye, Jaime, perdón, yo sé que toca tu turno, pero es que creo importante tocar este punto en este momento por lo que está comentando. Lo que pasa es que la pregunta también se la hice porque tal parece que en la actualidad los cómics están retomando lo que se ve en la pantalla o lo que se ve en la televisión, y no al revés como debía suceder antes. O sea, que la televisión y el cine tenían que agarrar esas historias para adaptarlas al cine, y ahora está pasando lo contrario. O sea, tú compras un cómic y parece ser que están agarrando elementos cinematográficos. O sea, ¿está pasando realmente eso?
Okay. No, what Daniel meaning with the question, Fabian, is if you, I don't know if you agree with us, but at this time, it's going opposite. Originally, the movies and the series, they were taking concept from the comics and trying to put it in their TV. Now it seems that because of the boom of the series and the movies, now the comics are adapting parts of the stories to the comics.
I would actually turn it around. I would actually turn that question around. I don't have to answer that. I would ask Daniel to answer that for me. Name me 5 things that the movies or the TV shows have taken, or that name me 5 things that comics have taken from the movies or the TV shows, and I'll name you 5,000 things that the movies and the TV shows have taken from the comics. I mean, yes, there's been a change in the approach to how the comics are told in a monthly basis. The decompressed storytelling style has affected the way that the narrative is done. Things are stretched out much longer. Things are far more visual than they used to be, where they used to be far more verbal. So in that regard, there is absolutely a change in the approach. But the truth of the matter, that's not so much because comics decided to play on the success of the movies, which has really only been happening since 2008 or so. The decompressed storytelling style happened in the early 2000s. And that was as much born of writers and editorial philosophy that wanted to approach the material in much more of a television narrative fashion. Not even a movie narrative fashion, a television narrative fashion. That's why you started getting your page one recap pages with our story so far, because that's exactly what television dramas were doing previously on whatever show you're watching. They became verbal only in so much as they became incredibly dialogue driven. And as a result, you'd have multiple pages of talking heads. So what ended up happening, combining that with the late 90s surge in what was called widescreen comic books, born of things like Brian Hitch's work, especially on things like Authority and stuff like that, those two things ended up merging quite a bit, actually, as a result of Marvel's Ultimate Comics and even Brian Hitch's work on the Ultimates. What ended up happening is you'd get a fantastic double-page spread of the aftermath of a battle and the remnants of what happened. Then you'd end up with 6 pages of characters talking about what happened. All right. What we used to do, and the way we were trained and taught in the comics that I grew up reading, and Daniel and I may be closer in age, I think, behind me than you and I are, but the comics we would read actually showed you the action as it was happening, and the characters talked over that while they were in the middle of action, which isn't realistic, but comics didn't need to be realistic. So what's happened as a result of that in the last 15, 20 years is you get a lot of writers who write about characters talking about what happened rather than showing the characters doing what happened. And again, that's as much television driven as it is movies. And I don't think that we're really seeing a lot of narrative storylines taken from the movies and applied to the comic books. Overall, maybe a visual look here and there just to try to get the characters to come a little bit closer, but there's still a tremendous difference in terms of the continuity of Marvel comics and the continuity of the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
That takes me to a question for you. Well, right now, it's, as you mentioned, it seems like they write stories, a 6-story saga for whatever reason. They're fighting against 1 billion, and it has to spread for 6 issues. But then you guys, when you were working in a group in the X-Men with X-Force, Uncanny X-Men, X-Men, Cable, X-Force, and you were working in a saga of 14 or 24 issues like the Executioner's Song or Fatal Attractions and things like that. How was working that way with all these great creators, writers?
Exhausting. It was exhausting, and that was less born of desire and more born out of the reality of the publishing budget, the publishing program's expectations. So if it were our preference, we probably wouldn't want to be doing a multi-title crossover 2 times a year is what it seemed to get down to. We would have probably preferred to do it once every 3 years, but the budget reality of the publishing program prevented us from being able to do it the way we would have preferred. So then you just work within the system that you kind of have to work in and try to make it as good as it possibly can be. What ends up happening is it had been a pretty self-contained crossover mentality that Chris Claremont and Louis Simonson brought to the books in the 80s, where just 4 issues or 6 issues of 2 titles or 3 titles crossed over because of a combination of the inherent desire and creative nature to always try to expand and one up what was done before, combined with the incredible greed of the people who owned Marvel Comics in the early 90s, turned it into 14-part crossovers and a 21-part Avengers crossover, which I also was heavily involved in breaking down. So it just becomes really daunting, and and expansive. So what ends up happening is it's actually a combination. I can't fault the company completely, because the creators saw that these things succeeded and they want success. So they want to get engaged in it. So more creators start getting together to say, let's do a crossover. For crying out loud, I initiated one between Nomad and Daredevil and Punisher, you know? So I got no one to blame but myself for that. That wasn't part of a budget expectation, but the Executioner song absolutely was part of a budget expectation for X amount of dollars that have to be made during this quarter of the publishing budget, you know? So that's kind of that kind of combination results in a bit of an escalation of that happening across the entire company. Then you also bring other companies into it who go, hey, wait a minute, look at that working, let's do it too. And they start doing it also. So it just becomes a proliferation of that within the totality of the industry.
Daniel, creo que es buena pregunta que ahorita le hagamos. En ese momento, Fabián nos decía que estaban en un gran boom con los cómics. Y ahora hablamos de un boom con las películas y la industria del cómic está muy baja. ¿Te parece?
Sí, y al respecto de eso, mi estimado Jaime, es mi siguiente pregunta. La crisis del cómic obedece no nada más al boom del cine, sino también al tema de la pandemia, del COVID. Yo creo que las dos cosas le están afectando. ¿Veremos en algún momento a las dos más grandes compañías de los cómics trabajar juntos para salvar esta industria del cómic impreso?
Fabián, we were talking that based on your comments on the early 90s, well, there was a boom in comics at that moment. However, at this time, the boom is on the movies. And the comic industry, in my point of view and Dana's point of view, I don't know about yours, are in a kind of crisis. So that would be the first question. You agree on that? And then Dana is asking a really interesting question. Do you think maybe in the future we will see DC and Marvel working together to save the comic industry, not the movies industry, the comic industry? What's your opinion?
You're not going to like my answers.
Okay.
Number one, the comics industry is not struggling at all. The comics industry is doing phenomenally well. You're talking about the mainstream superhero comic book format, okay? That's struggling. So the majority of what Marvel or DC release on a regular basis in your direct comic book specialty shops is struggling. Comic book content is selling wonderfully well in bookstores to young readers of wide diverse genre and age group. Digital comics are doing phenomenally well on a global scale that you can read my digital comic Outrage on Webtoon, which is a digital publisher, on your phone for free right now, okay? Outrage is one of Webtoon's lower subscribed titles, although it was really good for the North American launch they started, but in comparison to some of its Asian content, its subscriber base is still very low. Its subscriber base is still higher than anything that I've written for Marvel or DC since 1995. Okay, so I have over 200,000 subscribers to Outrage as a digital comic on Webtoon, and Juggernaut was a top 20 book for Marvel, issue number 1, and it sold 70-something thousand copies. Okay, so everybody who brings this subject to the table is bringing it to the table from a flawed perspective, and that perspective is that comic books equal Marvel and DC superhero comics. It's not true. It's just not true. All right, it may be how you perceive it, it may be how you want to perceive it. That's a completely different question. But if the question is the industry is struggling, the answer is no. The industry is like $1 billion industry and has been for the last couple of years. It's just that those numbers are being driven and those dollars are being driven from things other than the standard format mainstream superhero comic book, period. Okay, of course the movies are phenomenal, the movies are fantastic, and on a global level, the cost of a movie ticket is greater than the cost of a comic book. The distribution platform for movies is actually greater than the distribution platform for comics, which means the accessibility and opportunity to see a movie is much greater than the opportunity or accessibility to buy a comic book. So it's not that big a surprise that the movies are very successful, because they're taking characters that you and I both know are excellent and entertaining and fun to read, and translating them onto a platform that more people globally want to see them in, which is a movie theater, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. The companies are making a tremendous amount of money off these movies. So Marvel Comics benefits tremendously from Marvel Studios' success. Okay. So then the last question you asked me is, should Marvel and DC get together to do something? I have to give you my honest answer, which is a part of what I said you're not going to like. I don't care. I'm 60 years old this year. I'm doing a lot of different things. Comics is just one small little bit of what I do, and a small little bit of what I've done for the last 20 years. If I were an employee of Marvel Comics like I used to be, in the office every single day, I'd have a much greater vested interest in the answers and the solutions to the things you guys are citing. But I'm not. I'm just a writer. I'm a freelance writer, and I get paid less to do a 5-issue Juggernaut limited series as a freelance writer by exponential factors of dollars than I do for writing a book and selling a book, which I've just done in the last 2 years. So where do you think my focus and my creative energy is going to go? You know, it's not, I still love doing comics, but I've written over 1,000 comic books over 35 years. My emotional attachment to them is not of the present. It is of the past. It is what I read when I was growing up. It's reading a Marvel Masterworks or an old DC hardcover volume of the old stuff from the 60s and 70s and early 80s. That was my youth, my teenage years into my very early 20s, and then it was my profession. So I don't have the same emotional attachment to it after I became a professional, the way we all do to the comics we read when we were 14 years old. You know, so I have far more of an emotional invested interest in the book I'm working on right now, this is my second book, than I do in a comic book, for a wide variety of reasons.
I see. I understand. Daniel?
Told you weren't going to like the answer.
No, it's okay. I like your answer.
Estamos aprendiendo muchísimo. En lo personal, creo que las aportaciones que está dando el buen Fabián son muy importantes, mi estimado Jaime. Pero yo estoy observando en este momento su casa. Quiero meterme un poco ya más a ese tema. Estoy viendo cómo se compone su casa. Algunas personas que nos gusta esta industria del cómic, pues coleccionamos los cómics. Otros, pues coleccionan las películas, originales por supuesto. Otros coleccionan figuras de acción. ¿Qué colecciona alguien que se dedica a la industria del cómic? ¿Qué colecciona? ¿Qué puede encontrar en su casa de cómics?
This is a kind of a personal question, Fabian. Daniel is saying he's looking behind you, your house or there, and many of the comic fans, we like to collect either comics, or some people collect movies or action figures. What did actually Fabián Nicieza collect?
What I have 45, 50 long boxes of comics down in my basement, and that's half of what I used to have, because I moved from a house I lived in to the house I'm currently in about 6 years ago, and I got rid of half of what I had. So, you know, I have thousands of comics downstairs. I had a lot of toys, but I don't, they're all in boxes now. When I moved from the house I was in to the house I'm currently living in, I lost my office. So I had an office in my old house, and that had bookshelves with everything on it. I don't have that anymore. I'm sitting on my porch right now. This is a screened in porch. Look, there's the backyard. Okay. And my office is now my lap board. So wherever I take my lap board is where my office is. So I still have a lot of stuff, but it's not, most of it isn't out for overt display anymore. Most of it's in boxes, and I got to be honest with you, I'm going to get rid of a lot of that. And in the next few years, because I'm getting older. I want less clutter, not more. And it's a lot easier to have my Marvel comics in a Marvel Masterworks volume than it is to have it in bags and boards in the basement in a long box. So I'm actually going to get rid of a lot of my comics because I have the Marvel Masterworks of them. You know, so I'll keep those. I'll have those books forever if I ever feel like reading, you know, an old Submariner comic from the 1960s. I'll have that available to me. But I stopped collecting. I stopped collecting a long time ago. I stopped collecting stuff a long time ago. I did for quite a while, but when I say a long time ago, I mean about 10, 15 years is really when I cut back on buying and collecting stuff, toys or books or things like that. I just felt there was way too much paper in my life. I needed less menos papeles.
Exactly.
My wife doesn't even speak Spanish, but she was saying menos papeles, por favor. And that once you start getting rid of it, once you start cutting those ties, it becomes easier and easier to do, I think.
It's the first step.
Yeah, no, it is. It's like an addiction. Collecting is like an addiction. It really is.
It is.
I used to get all the comics for free too, because I worked at Marvel Comics and then I worked at Acclaim Comics. So all through the late 80s and 90s, I was getting all the publishers' comics for free. And that not anymore, not for a long time. And once you stop getting it for free, you're going, well, how much do I really want to buy? How much is out there that I'm really interested in buying? By the time I hit 40 years old and 45 years old and 50 years old, I had less and less of an interest in buying new comics, because I just kind of outgrew the interest in the storylines and the continuity of the characters. I still read a lot, but I do a lot of it digitally on my. I use my iPad. I have a Hoopla. It's a library app, and I always use that to read. Except I can't take anything out until the first of the month.
I see.
So there's this app called Hoopla. Should come up. Where are you? It's not coming up. Of course, it's cycling now. There we go. It's a library app, and you basically take library. So I read most of my comics on this thing now. And my only collecting vice is Marvel Masterworks. Honestly, that's the only collecting vice I still have. I get Marvel Masterworks regularly.
Daniel?
No, eso de alguna manera refuerza lo que platicábamos hace rato, ¿no? De la industria del cómic y de las grapas y de los cómics impresos. Hay mucha gente que ya se dedica a esas cosas. Pero bueno, nos quedan 10 minutos, mi estimado Jaime, así que te concedo la siguiente pregunta.
Muy bien. Okay, let's try to take the last 10 minutes of good questions. Okay, Fabián, now let's talk about a little bit on the movies and the series. And let's talk about a little bit of WandaVision and what do you think about the Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and what do you think of Justice League?
I liked WandaVision a lot. I thought it was really entertaining, really interesting. I thought the acting was real good. I wish that they had brought their storylines together a little more smoothly in the last couple episodes than they did. But I still think it was a very entertaining show. I have found that even the Marvel movies, anything done by Marvel Studios, even when it's just okay, it's still really good and entertaining. So even the worst Marvel movie to me still gets like a B- grade. And Falcon and the Winter Soldier, since the Captain America franchise is my favorite among the ones they've done, and Winter Soldier is, with all apologies to Richard Donner and Superman, Winter Soldier is the best superhero movie that's ever been made. So by far, to me, Winter Soldier is almost like an absolute perfect movie in terms of its writing, its direction, its construction, its pacing, everything, its music, everything. So I'm expecting I will enjoy Falcon and the Winter Soldier. I am not like the fans who need to speculate and have theories about what they think is going to happen. I find that actually a little unnecessary. So I don't engage in that. I'm already usually doing enough like editing or pre-writing in my own head. I don't need to share that with the world, mostly because I don't want to be proven wrong. So that's that. I think I saw the Justice League movie, the Snyder cut last week. I am not a fan of Zack Snyder's work overall, but I have seen every single movie he's ever directed. So I feel very comfortable in having an opinion on that because I give him his fair shot every single time, and he manages for the most part to disappoint me every single time. I do not like his DC movies at all. And with all that said, I think that the 4-hour version of the Justice League movie was better significantly than the theatrical release, and better by far than Batman versus Superman, which I might actually rank as one of the 5 worst movies I've ever seen in my life. Having said all that, though, I still don't think it's a good movie. I think it's a better movie, but I don't think it's good. I just think that it's completely lacking in an understanding of the reason why superheroes exist. And I just don't. I'm not a fan of his entire tone and template. His elimination of color from movies. His decision that this world that he wants to film does not have a sun in it. There is no daylight ever. Even scenes that take place in daylight are always muted and obscured. I just find it constantly dour and depressing and boring, and so I don't think it's a good movie. I think it was better though than the theatrical version, which was a very strange, weird, it's sort of taking 2 completely different clay sculptures and smashing them together and going, hey, look at my new sculpture. It just didn't work. But saying it's better than the theatrical version and saying it's better than Batman versus Superman, you have to acknowledge is not saying much. So it's not, I'm not giving it a lot of praise, but I am saying that at the very least we got to see his vision fulfilled, and I'm happy for his fans. He has a tremendous amount of fans. There's a lot of them, and if this is what they want out of a movie, and if this is what they want out of those characters, I'm glad you enjoyed it. It doesn't matter to me, that's not what I want out of those characters, and that's not what I want out of a Justice League movie. But fine. I'm glad you liked it.
Good, that's good. Okay, Daniel.
Mi estimado Fabián, pues estamos ya a punto de finalizar. Me gustaría que le enviaras un mensaje a todos los seguidores o a toda la gente que le gusta la industria del cómic en los países de habla hispana.
So, Fabian, if you want to say something to our fans in Latin America in Spanish, it would be great. Say that you will be interviewed here in Documentos Clasificados.
In Documentos Clasificados. Oh, that's fantástico. All I really want to say is that I hope that you keep enjoying reading, whether it be superhero comics or whether it be anything else. Just continue to enjoy reading the comic book material that you enjoy reading, and I hope some of that happens to be mine. I don't do that much anymore for a lot of very good reasons. The main one being that my first book will come out in June from Putnam Publishing. There is not a South American market or Central American market distribution yet, but it will be available in North America, which includes Mexico, United States, and Canada on June 22nd. It's called Suburban Dicks. It is a sarcastic mystery novel, and it'll be coming out in June, and that's hopefully primarily the focus I'd like to have in my career moving forward. But if you're a comics guy, I hope you keep being a comics guy.
Thank you.
Estimado Jaime, pues muchas gracias. Terminamos el día de hoy. Y bueno, pues agradecemos a Fabián Nicieza por haber estado con nosotros aquí en Documentos Clasificados. Muchas gracias, Fabián. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Hasta la próxima. Muchas gracias, mi estimado Jaime. Nos esperamos la próxima emisión con seguramente otra sorpresa. Hasta la próxima.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Jaime. Gracias, Daniel.
Pronto. Gracias.
Gracias,
Ciao,
Fabián.
guys.
Thank you.